The year 1949. An independent India awarded to itself its own constitution. And even as leaders of the country formalized the document with their signatures, the world was witnessing the birth of the largest democracy. A democracy which almost 50 years later would still be vibrant and successful. A democracy which took roots even when the infant nation was facing countless challenges. Challenges posed by underdevelopment, posed by the sheer diversity and the pluralistic composition of its people, religion and culture. The birth of India heralded a unique event in the world map. Even as the country was unshackling itself of its colonial past, another nation, Pakistan, was being carved out of its geographical entity. And the trauma of the ensuing partition would create convulsions and tragedy, as thousands were orphaned and still more rendered homeless. India was also born with the integration of over 500 princely states into its physical domain. For the millions who experienced this freedom, democracy would mean an opportunity to participate in the decision-making of the country. An opportunity denied to them by the sheer oppression of colonial rule. Democracy came naturally to the political leadership of the day. These were stalwarts who had sacrificed their own comforts and ambitions to win freedom for their country. And through the years of this unrelenting struggle, they had forged close links with the people of this nation. Over the years, they had helped create a mass movement. Throughout the years of this anti-colonial struggle, they had maintained close contacts with the common man and woman, articulated the aspirations of the deprived and the dispossessed.
They spoke the same language, they were familiar with the cultural ambiance of the place, they were familiar with the land, with the area, with the problems of the people and their grievance. That is what gave Indian nationalism the depth that it had, and in that, of course, the role of the leaders was of considerable significance.
It was significant that from the very beginning this point was understood, that one must make contact with the masses, that one must understand what their desires are, one must express them. And that is how the people can be mobilized. Otherwise, you don't get a mass movement at all.
The first general elections held in 1952 saw the Indian National Congress take advantage of this link they had forged with the people of the country. Pandit Nehru had mesmerized the nation with his personality, and he was elected as the first Prime Minister of independent India.
A man having a strong sense of history and commitment to the people of this country inspired confidence, almost limitless confidence in the mind of the people in him. That's why he was accepted as the undisputed leader in the post-independent India.
There were a galaxy of other leaders of the movement who were in the Congress at that time. And consequently, the people were mobilized by the Congress as a whole, but above all by Jawaharlal Nehru, who by that time had been for several years, decades in fact, a darling of the people.
What made the Indian experiment that much more exciting was its commitment to universal franchise. Democracy, as enshrined in its constitution, had been defined for all its citizens, irrespective of sex, caste, creed and religion. Women were given equal rights to vote much before many emancipated Western democracies had accepted this premise.
We had a large participation of women and equal, heroic deeds that women had actually performed. And all this really contributed to the consciousness of giving equal rights to men and women. I don't think there was even a hesitation in any quarter on this particular issue, and that got reflected in the new constitution.
Nehru and his colleagues were visionary enough to accept the reality that Indian democracy could only survive as a secular polity. The scars of partition may have created a communal divide, but they quickly bridged this with a healing touch, with an assurance to the minorities and other religious groups that they were equal citizens. Secularism was to become the bedrock of Indian democracy.
Secularism has a very long lineage in India. In fact, Indian national movement accepted secularism virtually at the same time as most of the European countries were accepting secularism. As you know, secularism basically came on the world stage with the French Revolution at the end of 18th century. It spread to Europe in the 19th century. It also spread to India. The Indian intelligentsia particularly was very strongly secular, also conscious of the fact that a multi-religious society like India cannot function except on a secular basis.
The Indian National Congress had been an umbrella organization. In the years when it had been in the vanguard of the country's freedom struggle, the Congress had co-opted almost all shades of political opinion in the country. However, even before independence, splinter groups had begun to desert the Congress. Some of these leaders, who had committed themselves to Gandhian values and who did not agree with the substance and style of the Congress after it had assumed power, formed the nucleus for the sharpest criticism of Nehru's foreign and economic policies.
Different views and dissension always strengthens democracy. And as there was dissension, Congress had the capacity within itself to have different views, to accommodate different views, to respect different views. That's why Indian democracy was strengthened.
One of the major achievements of Indian democracy was when the Communist Party was voted to power in 1957 in the southern state of Kerala. It was perhaps the first time in the history of the entire world that the Communists had captured power through the ballot box. Critics, however, point to the fact that within 2 years, this government was dismissed from the centre and fresh elections called for after a bout of central rule.
Communists winning was a triumph of democracy in that sense. And the dismissal of those governments was the remnants of autocracy that remain. I mean, that is the sort of a struggle that still continues within our country, but democracy is getting strengthened by the day.
A coalition headed by the Congress Party now came to power. Analysts recall that even if the method of the dismissal of the communist government could be called dubious, nonetheless, it was through a ballot box that once again the rule of law in this state was established. Nehru's death in 1964 saw the end of an era in Indian politics. However, 17 years of his leadership had ensured that the roots of democracy had been strongly embedded in the country.
It was Pandit Nehru who gave stability to the parliamentary institution or respectability to the parliamentary institution. That was a period when easily Pandit Nehru could have acquired all powers to himself. But he did not do it. He tried to establish the authority of the parliamentary institutions.
It was therefore not surprising that the transition from Nehru's leadership to that of Lal Bahadur Shastri was smooth. But there was an internal struggle for power within the Congress, which still remained the dominant political force in the country. and Shastri's sudden death in Tashkent after he suffered a massive heart attack brought this struggle in the Congress to the forefront. Indira Gandhi, daughter of Jawaharlal Nehru, was asked to assume the mantle of the Congress leadership. But by 1967, Indian democracy was facing other challenges. In most of the North Indian states, the Congress party had lost power. Coalition governments replaced the Congress rule.
Impact of the Indo-Pakistan War in 1965, late impact of Sino-Indian War of 1962 put tremendous strain on economy. In large part of the countries, food riots took place. These things made Congress unpopular. But from democratic point of view, it is a welcome feature because the non-Congress political parties for the first time made an attempt to rule through coalition.
In the centre, however, the Congress still ruled supreme. By 1969, the Indian National Congress had split, and Indira Gandhi became the sole and unquestioned leader of the party. After the 1971 war with Pakistan, which saw the birth of Bangladesh, Indira Gandhi was at the zenith of her popularity. Yet, within years, this image was to be dented. Charges of rampant corruption, resentment against rising prices led to a nationwide agitation against her government. The call to oust the Congress was led by veteran freedom fighter and socialist leader J.P. Narayan.
He did two things. One, he got the political parties brought into it. Two, he gave it an ideological content by saying that this is a movement for total revolution. What he meant was total change. In other words, the whole system needs to be attacked.
By 1975, Indira Gandhi was a prime minister under siege. And compounding her problems came a court ruling from the Allahabad High Court which found her guilty of electoral malpractice. The court's verdict was based on a technicality, but the political ramifications of this was immense. Indira Gandhi declared national emergency, arrested all opposition leaders and imposed censorship. For the first time since independence, it looked as if the death knell for Indian democracy had tolled.
If the people had not fought back, if the world had not put its own pressures on Mrs. Gandhi, who had then become dictator, if Mrs. Gandhi herself had not knuckled under pressure of public opinion and the pressure that was building up from the grassroots in the country, then yes, the whole situation would have ended up as the death knell of India's democracy.
However, by 1977, she lifted the state of emergency and called for fresh elections. Critics argued that despite the brief flirtation with authoritarianism, Indira Gandhi was a Democrat at heart, and she needed to get the endorsement of the people for her policies, legitimize her rule through a popular mandate.
Mrs. Gandhi, I tell, basically was not a dictator. Mrs. Gandhi was a Democrat. She cared for the wishes of the people. After 1.5 years, she realized that this method cannot lead her a long way, because she knew that by that method she cannot rule the country for a longer period. It was compulsion of the situation which made Mrs. Gandhi to go for elections, and she took a jump, whether in the dark.
The elections of 1977 were a watershed for Indian democracy. A group of political parties covering the entire spectrum of Indian polity got together to form the Janata Party. They fought the elections in a 1-to-1 electoral battle with the Congress, and Mrs. Gandhi's Congress was voted out of power.
It was the anguishedness of Indian people who wanted to reassert their rights. Somehow or other they had the feeling that they have been injured. And the way they reacted and responded in the election reflects their injured feelings.
Mrs. Gandhi, call it committed a mistake or a miscalculation and ordered elections. She was not able to gauge the mood of the people. And the people threw her out and threw out just about anyone who was identified with the emergency.
The Janata Party experiment was a short-lived one. The coalition collapsed under the strain of its internal contradictions. However, by 1980, Mrs. Gandhi and her Congress party was voted back to power. But the experience of 1977 had emphasized that democracy in the country could not be taken for granted. Nor could leaders expect to tamper with the country's basic democratic credentials and expect to go unchallenged. Political commentators refer to this period as an aberration.
It was an aberration, and aberration cannot continue for a very long period of time. Precisely this is the reason she thought that what was needed, she used the word shock therapy. A shock therapy was needed to put things in proper perspective, to put things in order. But once that stage was over, it was needed that the normalcy should be brought back.
The leaders have to pander to the people and beg of them to vote for them. I think that is why we've survived as a democracy and our neighbors have not, because it has become a habit and we really cherish our right to change our leaders when we want to.
Democracy practiced at the grassroots level is seen in the panchayats. The panchayats, or village councils, are the traditional style of decision-making, the local self-governments. It is the success of the panchayati form of governance that has given the Indian democratic system its credibility for the grassroots practitioner. But if democracy has survived 50 years of economic turbulence and social tensions, observers allot credit to two vital institutions: an independent press and an energetic and alert judiciary. Despite the criticism that the Indian judicial system is creaking and at times slow to deliver justice, it has been vigilant and an effective check against any constitutional impropriety. The Indian judicial approach was patterned on the lines of the British justice system. In fact, the Supreme Court of India took over from the Federal Court in 1950. And over the years, in a series of landmark judgments, the judiciary has kept the executive on its toes.
Many cases come up every day where executive action is challenged, and court looks into them, and time and again writs of different types are issued where it is found that the executive action is not consistent with the Constitution or any particular law under which it is made.
The judiciary, through its activism, has brought about enlightenment in the minds of the people as what they should expect from their government, and that nobody is above the law.
So robust has the Indian judiciary been that of late the debate in the media has centred on the extent and virtues of judicial activism. Public interest litigation has provided access to the courts for the common man. It has become a legitimate instrument to keep an effective check on erring politicians and bureaucrats.
Now, so far as India is concerned, the role assigned to the judiciary under the Constitution is that of a watchdog. When it works as a watchdog, it strengthens, it ensures that the legislature and the executive remain within the bounds of the Constitution.
The health of a country's democracy can be gauged by the freedom enjoyed by the media. Indian media remains remarkably unfettered. Whether in the English language or the regional languages, the country's press reflects a divergence of opinions, most of the time critical of the establishment and the government. The press has been responsible for putting top politicians and leaders in the dock. Investigative journalism, in fact, is attributed to not just exposing scams, but also toppling many state governments.
Media has, in many cases, toppled governments, and I think rightly so. It has campaigned against governments. The telephone tapping case with Ramakrishna Hegde, for instance, I do remember it kind of, the government collapsed. The Indian Express in Arun Shoury's days, I think, set a certain benchmark in terms of investigative journalism. Mr. Shoury's own campaign against A.R. Antule, his thing on the crude oil deal, I think all these were actually sterling examples. The Bofors case, which the Hindu and the Indian Express of those days took up, these were sterling examples.
The free press in India is today seen as one of the vital pillars of Indian democracy. The vigilance of India's fourth estate can be seen by the astounding number of newspapers and magazines published around the country. Although the country is saddled with low literacy levels, there is a palpable hunger for information and news.
What kind of democracy would it be had if there is no kind of information? See, in a democracy, it's all about making informed choice. And how do people make informed choice unless there's a media? So a media is, and a free media is a prerequisite for a functioning democracy.
You can't have genuine democracy unless people have the basis on which to intervene in decision making, and that basis is information. They must know what decisions the government is making, on what basis it's making them, how they're affecting different kinds of people and different groups in society, and what might be an alternative to those decisions and those policies. And the media plays an absolutely irreplaceable role.
This hunger is today being fed by the electronic media. Satellite links have ensured that international channels are now beamed into the country. Television has ensured that the remotest areas of India can today experience the power of information technology. And as the country marches to another millennium, Indian democracy finds yet another sentinel to safeguard its interests.
Electronic media is going to play a very, very crucial role in the country if it already is not. And television is really going to have an impact in terms of determining people's behavior, determining people's attitudes and ideas. It will take some time, but in due course it's got to happen.
One of the major achievements of Indian democracy in the past 5 decades has been its ability to maintain and preserve the supremacy of civil authority over the military. This in spite of the fact that the Republic has had to cope with separatist insurgency, ethnic strife and trans-border terrorism ever since the country became independent. For many observers, this supremacy of the civil authority has allowed democracy to flourish in the country. As 50 years of democratic traditions get embedded into the psyche of the nation, the electoral battles find themselves articulated with a unique vocabulary, colorful, vibrant, and seeking total participation of its citizens. Although there have been calls for reforming some infirmities in the electoral laws of the country, observers maintain that the sheer vitality with which democracy is practiced in the country is proof that this form of the government by the people, of the people, and for the people is here to stay.